May 15, 1945, Flensburg, Germany. The morning was cool and still over Glucksburg Castle, 3 kilometers north of Flensburg. Through the tall windows, Paul Nitze could see the calm waters of the Flensburg fjord, a deceptive peace after 6 years of destruction across Europe. Inside the castle, Nitze sat across from the man who had kept Nazi Germany's war machine alive through 3 years of relentless Allied bombing, Albert Speer. Speer, impeccably dressed despite being a prisoner, carried himself with calm precision. He was only 40, but already infamous as the man who had organized the German war economy with ruthless efficiency. There was no arrogance in his demeanor, only quiet calculation. Nitze, 38, was the vice chairman of the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, USSBS, a former Wall Street banker who had joined government service when his mentor, James Forrestal, called him to Washington in 1940. Now his mission was singular: to discover whether strategic bombing had truly crippled Germany and whether it could do the same to Japan. The war in Europe had ended just 8 days earlier. Germany had surrendered on May 7th, Hitler was dead, and his self-proclaimed successor, Admiral Karl Dönitz, was holed up in Flensburg with the last remnants of a government that no longer ruled anything. The Reich was gone, but its ruins might still teach valuable lessons, lessons that Nitze needed to learn fast as the Pacific War raged on. American bombers were devastating Japan, but no one knew whether those air attacks alone could bring surrender, or whether a ground invasion, expected to cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, would still be necessary. Speer was the key to finding that answer. As Minister of Armaments since 1942, he had directed every aspect of German war production: factories, labor, raw materials, and supply chains. He alone could explain how Germany had managed to fight so long under total bombardment and what finally broke its industrial backbone. But Speer knew the value of what he possessed. Unlike the more notorious Nazi leaders, he was neither a fanatic nor a visible architect of genocide. He was the technocrat, the rational administrator. If he cooperated, he might convince the Allies he was different, that he had simply been a professional serving his country, not a war criminal. Cooperation might save him from the gallows. He had decided even before the interrogation began to tell the Americans everything they wanted to know, except about the Holocaust. On that subject, he would feign ignorance. Nitze understood the game instantly. He needed data, not confessions. His focus was on production and bombing results, not crimes against humanity. The war crimes prosecutors at Nuremberg could handle that later. Nitze's mission was more immediate: to learn what kind of bombing had worked against Germany so the same principles could be applied to Japan. From May 15 through May 21, 1945, Nitze and his team, including the economist John Kenneth Galbraith and future diplomat George Ball, interviewed Speer for hours each day. Speer arrived punctually, polite and composed, bringing papers and diagrams to illustrate his points. He seemed almost proud to demonstrate the inner workings of a destroyed empire. He began with the statistics that had made him famous. When he took over the armaments ministry in 1942, Germany produced about 15,000 aircraft a year. By 1944, output had risen to nearly 40,000. Tank production increased 5-fold. Ammunition and weapons of all types multiplied. To the Allies, this armaments miracle had been baffling. How could a nation being bombed daily still increase its output? Speer explained that success came from dispersal and adaptation. When cities were bombed, factories were broken into smaller workshops scattered across the countryside, hidden in forests or underground mines. Production lines were simplified, designs streamlined, and every ounce of civilian capacity redirected to war goods. He described it as an engineering challenge devoid of emotion, omitting the suffering of the millions of forced laborers who made it possible.
Then Speer mentioned a date that made Nitze stop writing: May 12, 1944. On that day, more than 900 American heavy bombers struck Germany's synthetic oil plants, the source of nearly all its aviation and motor fuel. Refineries at Luna, Politz, Bruchs, and other sites were devastated. According to Speer, that day marked the turning point. Until then, Germany had kept its military supplied despite the bombing. After May 12, everything began to fall apart. The numbers told the story. In April 1944, Germany had produced over 300,000 tons of fuel. By July, that had dropped to one-third. By autumn, production had virtually ceased. American bombers kept returning to destroy whatever repairs German workers managed to make. By winter, the Luftwaffe was grounded, and panzer divisions could barely move. The fuel crisis crippled the entire war effort. Speer described the cascading effects. Aircraft production continued to climb, but new planes could not be flown because there was no fuel for training or combat missions. Germany's advanced jet fighters, the Me-262s, sat idle. Panzer divisions rationed gasoline so tightly that tanks often went into battle without adequate training runs. Even the last desperate German offensive, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, was doomed by lack of fuel. Commanders had planned to seize Allied fuel depots to continue the advance. When that failed, their tanks literally stopped moving in the Ardennes forests. Nitze pressed Speer on other bombing campaigns that had cost the Allies dearly, such as the 1943 raids on Schweinfurt, the center of ball bearing production. Those missions had suffered huge American losses. Speer's response was blunt. The attacks barely mattered. Germany had stockpiled bearings, used substitutes like sleeve bearings, and imported additional supplies from neutral countries. The Americans had miscalculated the target's importance. The raids inflicted far more damage on the U.S. Air Force than on German industry.
What about the transportation network? The railways that connected Germany's industrial heartlands? Speer admitted that by early 1945, attacks on rail lines had become devastating, cutting the Ruhr off from its coal supplies. But by then, he said, the fuel crisis had already crippled mobility. Trains and trucks could not run even when tracks were intact. The pattern was unmistakable. Bombing alone had not destroyed Germany's war production. In fact, dispersal and efficiency had allowed factories to survive the worst attacks. The single decisive factor was oil. When the refineries went down, the entire industrial and military machine collapsed. Everything, tanks,